Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Neurotrition Podcast, where we give you the tools to balance the brain, optimize the body, and redefine how to unlock human potential. We're going to be talking today about Andropause, a process men typically experience in their late 30s to mid 40s, and it's typically marked as this drop in testosterone production.
The Neurotrition Podcast is sponsored by North Florida Spine and Wellness and produced by Jumine Delmas Studios.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Neurotrition Podcast, where we give you the tools to balance the brain, optimize the body, and redefine how to unlock human potential. I'm your host, Dr. Z, and today's show, I'm going to make myself a little bit vulnerable as I'm going to share my own story on how I address something males rarely even recognize is going on in their body. And it's often very rare, even more rarely, to be brought up by their doctor. We're going to be talking today about Andropause, a process men typically experience in their late 30s to mid 40s, and it's typically marked as this drop in testosterone production. But how it presented with me and how I went about fixing it might come as a surprise. So don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. And don't forget to drop us a comment on what you thought about the show. So let's start with a little bit about what andropause is. This is when we have a gradual decline in testosterone. It usually starts, like I said, in the late 30s to the mid 40s. And unlike menopause, this is more of a slow decline. With women, we typically see large drop-offs that create a little bit more severe symptom onset. And with men, it's kind of with this gradual decline, you kind of just, slowly feel worse. And so it's not as obvious. There are some key hormones that are involved. DHEA is one of them, growth hormone. Obviously, we're going to be talking about testosterone, but also looking at cortisol balance, just like we talked about in the last episode when we were dealing with women. Now, for me, when I started having symptoms, and frankly, I had no idea that it was related to my declining testosterone. I just felt burned out. I felt tired. I felt depression and anxiety. But, I own a business. I treat lots of people. I have a special needs child at home. And so, just dealing with life, I felt like it was just the overwhelming nature of my life that was just burning me out, creating all of these symptoms. And it wasn't until I happened to do my yearly blood work, and I was just curious, like, I probably should check my testosterone. Let me see where I'm at. And I was absolutely in the tank. I had testosterone in the mid 200s, I think it was, which is very low for my age. And for most men, they don't think there's a problem unless their libido is bad or they're having erectile dysfunction issues. But for me, it was really about that just burnout. I just was disinterested. I was unmotivated. I felt like my ADHD, and I've always felt like I had a little ADHD, but I felt like that ADHD type of symptoms was going through the roof. And so for me, it was a very kind of unlikely scenario of what I was experiencing. And I think that's true of a lot of men, especially men who go very hard. They have very busy and frankly intense lives they are living. And so it's really important that we start off with, just like I talked with women, and I talk about most problems that we talk about on this podcast. A lot of this stuff starts in the brain. Just like women, we have hormone signaling from the brain that tells our endocrine system what to do. And it's really important to look at that, especially with the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Okay. This is an axis that is affected by the cortisol swings that are involved in stress. And so that was one of the first things that I looked at with myself. What is my cortisol balance? And I did. I had some imbalances with cortisol at different parts of the day that I had to address. The next thing that was really important for me to regulate in my life, because my stress is not going to go away, and that's true for many people, whether you're a caregiver or you're like myself and own a business, or maybe you just have a very demanding job where it's a very intense situation, lots of pressure. You have to, while those individuals know that they cannot get rid of that stressor, it's important to deal with how your body modulates that stress. And so that's where things like vagus nerve stimulation is something I think most people should be doing, especially as they get into middle age. It helps increase that parasympathetic response. That's the young part of your nervous system. It's what allows you to regenerate and heal. And anytime we can maximize that parasympathetic system, everything is going to work better as a result. So just because you don't see any end to your stress is not a reason to just ignore it and do nothing to improve your resiliency, because getting some stimulation into that vagus nerve, into your frontal lobes, which help modulate that limbic system response, being able to improve the function of those parts of your nervous system is going to help you deal with that stress much better. I know with me, I got where stress was impacting me more and more, even as things got taken off my plate, found ways to make my business run more efficient, delegate more things to other staff. I still found that I was irritable. I was reactive, which is a weakness I have and I've had throughout my whole life, but it was getting worse. And I knew the main reason behind that was I just didn't feel good. Okay. And so being able to deal with those parts of your neurology are very, very important, not only how you're going to respond emotionally, but if you can't regulate those systems or create some resiliency in those systems, then you're going to struggle even if you get to normal testosterone levels, or you're going to continue to burn them out. So for me, it was using those adaptogen herbs. I mentioned that back on the last episode when we talked about modulating cortisol with women. That was very, very helpful. And then we started replacing some testosterone. But here's the key: you can't just go and replace testosterone with Andropause. Okay. You have to do some other things, because testosterone replacement can have some negative effects. It can increase your red blood cell count, okay, which can end up being a cardiovascular risk. It can raise your estrogen. Just like women take testosterone and aromatize it into estrogen, so do men. So that comes back to looking at our genetics. I had a genetic weakness where I tend to aromatase estrogen more, or testosterone more to estrogen than other people. And I also had a gene that told me I was likely to have more sex hormone binding globulin. And so knowing that information, I could proactively take herbals and different natural compounds to have offset that as we started to ramp up our testosterone input into my body. So that was things like Tonkat Ali, a really cool herb that does a very good job of lowering that sex hormone binding globulin. And it's going to make more of that testosterone available to the actual cells. And that's important, because if you crank up a bunch of testosterone, but it's all bound up by this globulin, just like we talked about with estrogens in women, it's not gonna, you're not gonna feel better. It's not gonna go to the cell. The number two thing I did, which was probably the number one thing, is I made a commitment to changing my lifestyle. I tell people every day that you need to exercise, that you need to eat right. And dietary wise, I wasn't really doing anything that I don't tell my patients to do. But because of the demands of my life, I didn't exercise. I'm on my feet all day here at the office, seeing patients, but that is not the same as productive, focused weight training, resistance training, getting yourself to sweat, getting that cardiovascular exercise in there. It was zero. I'll be honest. I wasn't doing any of it. The only way with my schedule that I had time to do any physical exercise, so I had to get up at 5 in the morning. And that became something that was not sustainable for me and my lifestyle. So I changed my schedule. That was the thing I made. I knew I had to make a commitment to this. And this is one thing I would suggest when you're going through this process and trying to make large changes that where these negative habits or lack of habits, of positive habits, has been in your life for quite a while. You want to make sure that you do it in a way that you're going to be successful. Set yourself up for success. And for me, it was making a very small commitment so I would succeed in the beginning and then I could expand on that. So for me, it was trying to parse out 2 days a week where I didn't start till later in the morning. And so that gave me 2 days a week. I could easily go to the gym at 7 in the morning, get 45 minutes to an hour in workout, and then go to work. And it was amazing that it wasn't until I introduced that just 2 times a week that I started to feel better. I started to feel more motivated. Okay. My energy improved. Okay. And I even started the testosterone before I went to that step of doing that physical work. And I did, I felt better on the testosterone, but I did not feel as good as I did once I started moving. Okay. And that was a huge step for me. And once I was able to quickly develop 2 days a week, I wanted to go more during the week. So I was able to then find the time, or was more motivated to go early or on the weekends or a Friday afternoon. And next thing you know, I'm doing, I'm lifting 3 to 4 days a week and doing cardio at all of those sessions. And then it starts to snowball. Just like when we talk about these negative feedback loops with your fight and flight response that then wears out your adrenals, then decreases your hormones, just way those negative feedback loops can snowball and make you worse and worse and worse. These positive feedback loops can do the opposite when they make you feel better and better and better, and then you get better and better results. Now, when I went, as we've gone through this, and I was aromatizing too much, we did have some issues with too much estrogen. So, just like women, I put myself on the DIM and calcium D-glucarate, which helps decrease and detoxify that extra estrogen that was being shifted from testosterone. That normalized that. We didn't have to do any medications in my case, which was awesome. That's one thing I don't want to happen when people go through hormone replacement is you end up getting, compounding pharmaceuticals just to get through the negative side effects of this treatment. So I think it's good to maybe start a little bit lower dose. Make sure you have that lifestyle in place because you pump this testosterone into the system. And if you're not doing resistance training, you're not really stimulating your body to want to utilize that testosterone that's not now coming in at much higher physiological doses. And that's going to cause extra estrogen. That's going to lead to a negative if you're not making that very, very important step. So we did those things. Like I said, we started freeing up. I started lowering that sex hormone binding globulin. And then, of course, I dealt with the stress. That fight and flight response, doing vagus nerve stimulation was all very critical to improving my case. Okay, so let's recap what every male needs to know as they start either being suspicious of andropause or are having real symptoms of it, and what they need to be able to communicate to their doctor, and what kind of doctor you want to look for to work with to have the most optimal response possible. So the first thing is identify your stressors. Look at that stress response. Do you live a very stressful life? Is there a lot of pressure in your life to begin with? Is that possibly a system that is dysregulating in your body? And then you want to make sure you get good blood work. There's going to be a lot, just like we talked about with females, looking at thyroid function. Even though I don't see thyroid go off as often with men as we see it in females, can be a problem. It can be that slower metabolism is going to affect cellular energy and your motivation systems, the ability to go do those lifestyle things that I talked about. So having that TSH, that free T4, that free T3, maybe some thyroid antibodies, maybe a reverse T3, all of those things can help us get a better clinical picture of how that's working. Looking at the cortisol response, one thing that I always tell people is that when we talk about cortisol and the adrenals, blood tests aren't very good. They don't give us a very good sense of what the adrenal glands are doing functionally. So, saliva testing for cortisol is my preferred way to look at them, and and when we do that, we can kind of measure that cortisol response throughout the day, which is very important because sometimes cortisol is wonky in the morning, but not so through the rest of the day, or vice versa. So identifying where those cortisol imbalances are important because that's going to dictate how you treat it. You're going to want to look for your sugar metabolism. Do you have a high A1C? Are you pre-diabetic? Do you have high insulin? All of those types of things are going to be very important to know what kind of metabolic work you may need. Maybe you need to change your diet. Maybe we need to do things like berberine to help balance your sugar response off, get down to that insulin sensitivity. Because even if you have a relatively healthy diet, cortisol, when we think about people who take prednisone, for instance, that is a synthetic cortisol. Prednisone is very known. You got to be very cautious on giving that to people with diabetes because it will crank your blood sugar. So just a dysregulated stress response in of itself can cause some insulin resistance. So that's very important to know if that's happening. Then, of course, you want to see if there's inflammation. Essential fatty acids, knowing your omega-3 to your omega-6 balance can also be something that's very important. And that was way off on me. I blame it on my wife because she doesn't like fish. So we don't eat fish very often in the house. She already blames everything on me, so I might as well get one in there, right? So that is something that I think is very essential. Homocysteine on how you're metabolizing B vitamins is also a very good inflammatory marker to run. High sensitivity C-reactive protein is also a good measure for inflammation. And then I think it's good for everyone to do a good functional epigenetic test to kind of know where your weaknesses are, so you can look at your hormone metabolism, that sex hormone binding globulin. Do you have a risk factor towards that? And then, of course, you want to measure that sex hormone binding globulin in your blood test as well. That's also a very good thing to run. And then also, when they're actually measuring testosterone, make sure that your doctor is running a free testosterone. Free testosterone just means that's what's available for the cells to use. So if you have good total testosterone, but your free testosterone is not so good, then we know that your body is not able to utilize that testosterone. So that's really, really essentially the main thing we want to know is what's bioavailable for your cells to use. So once you have all of that information, you need to start also developing that lifestyle strategy. Okay. And like I said, in my case, it's very important to start at a point where you can succeed. Set yourself up for success, not for failure. Don't try to go from doing nothing to doing everything overnight. That is unlikely to be successful for most individuals. Some people can do that, but in my experience and in myself, that is not how I accomplish new routines and make positive changes. I have to do it in a way that I build a routine through some early successes. And that's what I was talking about when I started off just doing 2 days a week. I knew in my head that 2 days a week was never going to be enough to make the changes I want to make. Some supplementation to think about for you when you're starting to go through this is obviously you need to balance out what the lab tests say. So, like I said, Berberine is my go-to for blood sugar handling issues. There's some other things we use, but that is a good one. Toncatali can help lower that sex hormone binding globulin. If you're doing some testosterone replacement, you need to know, and if your estrogen starts to go up, We need to use things like calcium D-glucarate and DIM to help modulate that aromatase testosterone response. Then methylated B vitamins. Now, there's some people who don't respond well to methylated B vitamins. There's a minority of people, but there is a group of those folks. And so that's where you want to use different forms of that. That's something we can talk about on a future episode. But you may need to use some different forms of B vitamins that are still bioavailable, but not necessarily methylized. And that's why I think genetics are so important. Those are the type of tests that can predict if you're going to have that issue before you feel bad from taking a certain type of B vitamin. And when you do that in the right doses and in the right way, those are what's going to lower inflammatory markers like we mentioned, like homocysteine. If those essential fatty acids are not balanced, a good omega-3. Now, I really, really implore people, when you take fish oils, don't take just any fish oil. There is a select few companies that will actually test the fish for things like heavy metals and different toxins. And that's very important to get good sources of omega-3, okay? Because there's a lot of toxicity, especially heavy metals, in a lot of fish out there, especially in certain fish oil products. So I highly recommend looking at companies that do that type of testing. And that's what we do in our office is you utilize those. So once you have all of that kind of baseline supplementation, you can do some direct things to increase testosterone. Definitely the adaptogens, which helping modulate that cortisol response, is going to be one of those things that are helpful. Herbs like tribulus can be helpful. There's a bunch of other herbs that can be helpful to boost that testosterone level. But the big thing is you're going to get the biggest boost from being physical, getting into doing some resistance training, getting active, getting moving. That's going to have more impact. And even if you just do herbs or hormone replacement, that physical activity, I know I've kind of beaten the dead horse at this point, but that's going to be very important, whether it is for your body to use it because you're getting replaced through more of a prescription route, or if you're trying to boost it naturally through some certain herbals. Lifting weights is going to be a big part of it. Now, if you're in a position where, okay, I haven't lifted weights in 10 years. I haven't really been physical active in a long time. Your body composition looks like you have just low muscle mass in general. Then you may want to think about taking some creatine. Creatine is, we did a whole episode on that, on how successful that is, not only physically with, building muscle and that kind of thing, which will assist you as you go through that lifestyle change, but it's also very helpful cognitively. Okay. You're going to feel more motivated. You're going to feel more attentive. Memory is better. There's studies on that. Creatine is naturally in your brain, which a lot of people are kind of surprised to hear that. But these are all the things you need to consider as you're going through this. And the last takeaway I really want to hammer home is be proactive. Do not wait for some obvious symptom. Like I mentioned before, most men don't even consider low testosterone. And like I said, I was shocked when I saw my testosterone level was low on a blood test. I really hadn't even considered that at this point. Pay attention to your emotional responses, how you feel, how's your motivation, how's your anxiety, are you depressed? Listen to those symptoms and don't even wait for those symptoms to come forward before you start looking and measuring your testosterone levels. I think it's always good, even when you're feeling great, to be proactive on some of these things, because it's never like a light switch. Okay. It's not like testosterone goes down overnight and you feel terrible tomorrow. Okay. That's not how it works. And that feeds into the other thing is, don't just wait for these obvious sexual type of symptoms like erectile dysfunction or your libido going down. I think that's the only way most men recognize there might be a problem there, is when they get that kind of symptomatology. But for a lot of males, it's more of this emotional response. It's getting more irritable. It's, not being, like I said, motivated, or having the focus and attention to your job and your life that you're having. So that's really my message for all men out there, is to be proactive on this front. Because just like we talked about with women, that you don't have to feel miserable as these changes happen, we don't have to be miserable either. Okay. And it needs a lot more recognition, a lot more attention by the medical system in general. And I think these are some really great tools that you can use to help guide yourself through this. So that's it for this episode of the Neurotrition Podcast. I really hope this helped men start to understand and even recognize that some of the symptoms of lowering testosterone that you maybe never even thought of, outside of the obvious. And maybe even this is a good information for the women out there to know why your husband or your significant other may not be themselves, may be just unmotivated, not really enjoying life at the level they were in the past. It's really important not to ignore these things. I mean, this is the best I've felt in the longest time that I can remember, both mentally and physically, by making some of these important changes and realizing the root of the problem. So don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, and drop us a comment on what you thought about the show. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode of the Neurotrition Podcast. And don't forget, you don't have to feel miserable out there. We can improve our health. We can maximize our health and live the best version of our lives that we can. See you next time.